Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, in the cold, gray days of December 1872, a ship was spotted drifting without purpose. Her sails were set, her hull was sound. Her cargo, 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, was largely intact. The lifeboat was gone. The crew was gone. The captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter were gone. Not a body was ever recovered. Not a single credible witness ever came forward. And to this day, not one official inquiry has ever produced an explanation that survives serious scrutiny. The ship was the Mary Celeste, and what happened aboard her remains one of the most carefully buried mysteries in maritime history. What makes this story so unsettling is not simply that people disappeared. People disappear at sea. Ships sink. Crews perish. Those are tragedies, but they are familiar ones. What makes the Mary Celeste different? What has kept investigators, historians, and obsessives returning to her for a century and a half is that everything pointed to survival. The food was plentiful. The water was fresh. The navigation instruments were in place. There was no storm damage. There was no fire. There was no structural failure. By every observable measure, the ship was fine. The people simply were not there. The year was 1872. The age of steam was still finding its footing, and merchant sailing vessels like the Mary Celeste were the arteries of transatlantic commerce. She was a brigantine, a 2-masted cargo ship, solid and well-regarded. Built originally in Nova Scotia in 1861 under the name Amazon, she had changed hands several times, been refitted, and by 1872 was registered in New York under American colors. She was not a glamorous vessel. She was a working ship, and on the 7th of November, 1872, she had a job to do. Her cargo was 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, bound for Genoa, Italy. Her captain was Benjamin Briggs, 43 years old, a respected and deeply religious man who had commanded vessels since his early 20s. He brought with him his wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, and their daughter Sophia, who was not yet 2 years old. Their older son, Arthur, remained in school at home. The crew consisted of 7 men, many of them German-speaking and experienced sailors. In total, 10 people boarded the Mary Celeste in New York Harbor. Not one of them would ever be seen again. The question this story asks, the question it has always asked, is simple and terrible. What did those 10 people encounter that made them abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? And the deeper, more troubling question beneath it, why does every official answer, every tidy explanation offered across 150 years, fall apart the moment you look at it closely? The story, as most people know it, goes something like this. On the 4th of December, 1872, the British brigantine Dei Gratia spotted the Mary Celeste adrift approximately 400 miles east of the Azores. The Dei Gratia's captain, David Reed Morehouse, recognized the vessel. He had, in fact, dined with Captain Briggs just days before both ships departed New York. When the Mary Celeste failed to respond to signals, Morehouse sent a small boarding party across. What they found was remarkable in its ordinariness. The ship was in reasonable sailing condition. There was food in the galley. The crew's personal belongings, pipes, oilskin boots, clothing, remained in the quarters. The last entry in the ship's log was dated November 25th, placing the vessel near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. By the time she was found, she had drifted roughly 400 miles in 9 days, moving, under partial sail, in the rough direction of Gibraltar, as though guided by ghost hands. The official inquiry was convened in Gibraltar, under the authority of Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General for Gibraltar. Flood examined the ship, the crew of the Dei Gratia, and the physical evidence aboard. He found no survivors, no bodies, and no definitive cause for abandonment. The inquiry ultimately returned a salvage award to the Dei Gratia's crew, though a reduced one, a detail worth remembering. The official conclusion, to the extent one was ever formally stated, was that the ship had been abandoned in circumstances unknown. The sea, it was implied, had simply taken its people, as the sea sometimes does. That is the official story. It is clean, it is unsatisfying, and it is, on closer inspection, riddled with problems. The first crack appears almost immediately when you examine the physical evidence. Not what was absent from the ship, but what was present, and in what condition. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia stepped onto the Mary Celeste, they noted several things that should have demanded explanation but were largely passed over in the official inquiry. The ship's compass was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. The binnacle, the housing that protects the compass, had been knocked off its mounting entirely. A ship's compass is perhaps the single most critical navigational instrument aboard any ocean-going vessel. It does not simply fall off. And yet this detail, this act of destruction or violent displacement, received almost no serious attention from Frederick Solly Flood's inquiry. Then there was the question of the ship's papers. A captain at sea keeps his register, his bills of lading, and his crew list secured at all times. When the boarding party searched the Mary Celeste, they found the ship's papers missing. Not misplaced, gone. Taken deliberately, because papers of that kind do not simply blow overboard. Someone had removed the official documents of that ship. Someone had made a decision, under whatever circumstances prevailed, to take the ship's identity with them. Why? That question was never seriously pursued. And then there was the sounding rod, a metal instrument used to measure the level of water in the ship's hold. It was found lying on the deck, not stowed. This suggests that someone had been checking the water level in the hold very recently before abandonment. Someone had been measuring whether the ship was taking on water. But the hold itself showed no serious flooding. The ship was not sinking. So why was someone frightened enough to measure the water and then abandon a ship that was not sinking? Let us go deeper, because the deeper you go, the more the official narrative unravels. Consider Captain Briggs himself. He was not an impulsive man. Contemporary accounts describe him as methodical, cautious, and deeply experienced. He had commanded multiple vessels without incident, and was known to be protective of his family. He had chosen, on this voyage, to bring his wife and infant daughter. This is a man who does not panic. This is a man who, if he had reason to abandon ship, would not do so without extraordinary cause, and would not do so without preparing, without taking provisions, without securing as many of the ship's papers as he could carry. And yet the lifeboat, the single yawl boat that was davit mounted on the main deck, was gone. It had been launched, or released, and it had not been recovered. What is known, from the marks left on the deck, is that the lifeboat was not simply cut loose in a panic. There is evidence that a line, a rope, was run from the ship to the departing lifeboat, suggesting that whoever left was attempting to be towed behind the ship, close enough to return if the danger passed. That line had been severed. Whatever threat caused the abandonment was urgent enough that someone cut the tow rope. The people in that lifeboat were no longer trying to stay close to the ship. They were fleeing. Now consider the timeline. The last log entry, dated November 25th, places the ship near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The Dei Gratia found her on December 4th, roughly 400 miles farther east. That means the ship sailed, unmanned and under partial canvas, for approximately 9 days across open ocean. And during those 9 days, she was apparently sighted by no other vessel. In 1872, the North Atlantic shipping lanes were among the busiest waterways in the world. Dozens of ships passed through those waters every week. How does a drifting, unmanned brigantine go unnoticed for 9 days? It is worth noting, too, that when the boarding party checked the cargo, they found 9 barrels of the 1700 had been broached. That is, the barrels had been opened or had leaked. These 9 barrels were made of red oak, rather than the white oak used for the rest of the cargo. Red oak is more porous, and alcohol fumes from these barrels may have accumulated in the hold. This has become, in later years, one of the most frequently cited explanations for the abandonment. The crew feared the hold was about to explode. It is a reasonable theory, but it is not a complete one, because the hold, when examined by the boarding party, showed no evidence of actual combustion. There was no fire damage. There was no burn marks. There was no explosion. The fumes that may have alarmed the crew had simply dissipated into the cold Atlantic air. Is it possible that something else entirely was driving the abandonment? Something that never made it into any official record, because the only people who knew what it was had vanished? The theory that has persisted longest, and that carries perhaps the most circumstantial weight, involves the relationship between the Mary Celeste and the Dei Gratia. Consider the following sequence of facts. Captain Morehouse of the Dei Gratia had dined with Captain Briggs just days before departure. Both ships left New York Harbor within days of each other, bound for Europe. The Dei Gratia arrived at the Mary Celeste and claimed salvage rights, a claim worth a significant sum of money. The salvage award, when it was granted, was reduced because Frederick Solly Flood suspected something was wrong, though he could never prove what. Flood, for his part, initially believed there had been a conspiracy between the two crews, a manufactured abandonment designed to collect salvage money. He suspected foul play. He never stopped suspecting it, and yet he could prove nothing. What if Flood was onto something? Not necessarily a cynical insurance scheme, but something more complicated. A meeting at sea, arrangements made, a plan that went catastrophically wrong? The problem with this theory is that it requires a degree of conspiracy that would have been almost impossible to maintain across 10 people, none of whom ever resurfaced. And it does not account for the fact that no survivor ever claimed the salvage money on behalf of the Briggs family. There is another theory, quieter and more disturbing in its implications. What if the crew encountered something in the water, not supernatural, but biological or chemical, something that caused sudden mass disorientation? The Azores are geologically active. The waters near Santa Maria, where the last log entry was written, sit above volcanic formations. There are documented cases in that region and others of underwater volcanic events releasing sulfur compounds or carbon dioxide in sudden plumes, events that can cause rapid incapacitation, panic, and disorientation in anyone caught above them. A crew already alarmed by alcohol fumes in the hold, suddenly confronted with an apparently erupting sea surface, might have made the catastrophically wrong decision to abandon a ship that was, in fact, perfectly safe. Is it possible that the Mary Celeste's crew were not running from a danger aboard the ship, but from a danger in the water beneath it? A danger that, once they were in the lifeboat, proved fatal and left no trace? What is most striking, when you sit with the archival record long enough, is not what the documents say, but what they conspicuously avoid saying. Frederick Solly Flood's investigation produced hundreds of pages of testimony and analysis. And yet certain questions were never formally asked. The crew of the Dei Gratia were questioned extensively about what they found aboard the Mary Celeste, but they were almost never pressed on the specifics of their timeline. Specifically, how long they observed the drifting vessel before boarding her, and whether any of them had previously had contact with the Mary Celeste during the voyage. The boarding party's account of conditions aboard was accepted with relatively little challenge, despite the fact that these were the very men who stood to gain most from the salvage award. There is also a detail buried in the testimony of Oliver Deveau, the first mate of the Dei Gratia, who led the boarding party. Deveau described finding the ship's cargo hatch, a large wooden cover over the main hold, lying upside down on deck. Not simply open, but inverted. A cargo hatch does not invert itself. It must be forcibly removed and flipped. Someone had done this deliberately, presumably to air out the hold as quickly as possible. This is consistent with the alcohol fume theory, but it also suggests that there had been time and calm enough for someone to take a considered action before the abandonment. This was not a panicked scramble. This was a measured, if frightened, response to a perceived threat. And then there are the words of Captain Briggs himself, in a letter written to his mother just before departure from New York. The letter, which survives, describes the cargo somewhat uneasily. Briggs notes the quantity of alcohol and expresses a mild concern, though not alarm, about the nature of the freight. This is a small thing, but it is the last written trace of a man who was methodical enough to leave a paper trail across his entire career, and it suggests that even before departure, Briggs was thinking carefully about what he was carrying. His wife Sarah wrote a letter on the same date, which also survives. She was cheerful, affectionate, delighted to have little Sophia with her on the voyage. She wrote of the ship, the weather, the prospect of seeing Europe. Her words are almost unbearable to read now, knowing what came after, not because they are dramatic, but because they are so entirely ordinary. So certain that the future was simply the future, and that the ship would arrive, and that life would continue. It did not continue. Something intervened, and whatever intervened left no witness, no wreckage, and no explanation that has ever fully satisfied anyone who has looked carefully at the evidence. The Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar under the command of a skeleton crew from the Dei Gratia. She was eventually repaired, sold, and returned to service. She changed hands several more times, each transaction slightly more hurried than the last, as though her new owners could not quite get comfortable with what she carried, which was not cargo by then but reputation. She was finally run aground deliberately off the coast of Haiti in 1885, in what was later determined to be an insurance fraud. Her story, appropriately enough, ended with another act of deliberate deception. The 10 people who vanished from her decks in November 1872 were never found. No debris from the lifeboat was ever recovered. No account, no diary, no letter was ever discovered that shed new light on what happened in those waters between November 25th and December 4th. There is only the evidence the ship herself left behind: the overturned hatch cover, the missing compass, the absent papers, the sounding rod on the deck, and 9 breached barrels in a hold that never burned. Maybe the fumes drove them to panic. Maybe a volcanic event beneath the ship's hull created something they could not explain and could not endure. Maybe the answer is something even more mundane. A freak wave, a waterspout, a sudden loss of confidence in a ship that seemed, for a terrible few minutes, to be going down. Maybe Captain Briggs, a careful man, made the one catastrophic decision of his careful life and ordered the lifeboat into waters that swallowed it whole. Or maybe the truth is simpler and harder than any of that. Maybe 10 people saw something we do not have a category for. Maybe the Atlantic in late November of 1872 held a secret that it has kept perfectly in the century and a half since. Maybe the sea, which is older than any record we have ever kept, simply decided that this particular story was not ours to know. The ship drifted on. The ocean was quiet, and somewhere in the cold water between the Azores and the Strait of Gibraltar, 10 names passed from the living world into the permanent, indifferent silence of an unanswered question.